Virginia Woolf was convinced that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. Without the privacy of a room and security of a small income, the task of writing becomes much more difficult. These two things were often unavailable to men, but even less available to women, and in Woolf's view, partially contributed to the gender inequality in published writing. A Room of One's Own is based off two speeches Virginia Woolf delivered about women in fiction, though she expanded on those ideas for this book. And in her opening chapter, Woolf presents us with two fictionalized universities. Oxbridge is the equivalent of Oxford and Cambridge, British universities that were not fully open to women until 1920 and 1948, respectively. While there were female colleges at these two universities, they did not offer female students the same status or opportunities as male students. Later in the first chapter, Woolf contrasts Oxbridge with Furnham, a fictional stand-in for women's colleges, which were a relatively new phenomenon at the time. And this is just one of the various rhetorical techniques Woolf uses throughout her piece to point out the difficulty women writers face. As you read the text, pay attention to Woolf's arguments and evidence, and decide whether you ultimately find her arguments and her evidence and her overall thesis convincing or not. In order to help you make those decisions, join me as we explore the social and historical contexts that shaped Woolf's thinking and writing in A Room of One's Own. Virginia Woolf was born Adeline Virginia Stephen in 1882 and died in 1941. Her father and mother were both involved in literary circles. Her mother wrote children's stories, and her father was an editor of the Dictionary of National Biography in Britain. It was the second marriage for both of Virginia's parents, so Virginia had 3 full siblings and 4 half-siblings. Unlike her brothers, Virginia and her sister Vanessa had no formal education, but Virginia wanted to be a writer from a young age. Her father, though, did grant her full access to his library, which contributed to her education as a child. Her sister later trained, though, and became a painter. When Virginia was 13, her mother died, which resulted in a severe bout of depression. Her father died 9 years after her mother, and at this point in her life, Virginia had a full-blown nervous breakdown and actually attempted suicide. Some scholars believe these mental health issues may have been the result of sexual abuse she experienced at the hands of one of her half-brothers. Eventually, Virginia's full siblings all took a house and lived together, and their home became a place of literary and radical thought where the thinkers and artists of the day would gather to share ideas. These gatherings became known as the Bloomsbury Group. In 1906, Virginia suffered another loss, this time her brother Toby, which devastated Virginia and her sister Vanessa. 6 years later, Virginia married Leonard Woolf, someone she had met through the Bloomsbury Group, who was a friend of her brother Toby. Her husband was also a writer. He had been involved in colonial enterprises for Britain, but then left that occupation. He then ended up writing anti-colonial pieces and was a major advocate for peace and justice in the world. In 1913, Virginia attempted suicide again, convinced she was a terrible writer, wife, and sister. After 1915, though, she managed to get her mental health mostly under control, and she maintained that control for most of the rest of her life. She and her husband founded Hogarth Press, a publishing company. And as a writer, Woolf is really famous for experimenting with different forms of narrative technique and structure in her work. She also utilized stream of consciousness, which really kind of cements her very firmly with the modernists, who are really very much experimenting with the way we tell a story. And she is known for being a writer in a variety of genres. She wrote fiction and nonfiction, essays, novels, reviews, memoirs, plays, letters. She wrote 18 published pieces in her life, and had many, many more unpublished ones in her records. Like some of the other authors we've looked at this semester, Virginia seems to have been somewhat bisexual, or potentially just not fitting the norms of heterosexuality. In 1924, an aristocrat named Vita Sackville West began to court Virginia, and the two began a lesbian affair that lasted for a few years. Virginia was also opposed to war and fascism. So during World War II, she really suffered kind of another lapse in mental health, due from kind of the stress and, sort of the uncertainty of those times. And unfortunately, in 1941, she walked into the river outside of her country house in Rodmell, called Monk's House, with stones in her pocket and drowned herself. So again, we see that Virginia Woolf, at the end of her life, unfortunately, is unable to escape that pressure and that self-doubt and that insecurity that her mental illness led her to have. And again, I think pointing out the fact that many writers sort of struggled with mental illness and that we didn't have the tools to help them cope with those mental illnesses, which makes kind of some of their life stories rather tragic. So like Zora Neale Hurston, Virginia Woolf is writing during the modernist period, though of course she's writing it across the pond in Britain. And The era that she and other modernists are kind of rejecting in their work is the Victorian era, which began in 1837 and died in 1901. And 1837 is the year that Queen Victoria took the throne, and 1901 is a year after her death. So the era is very much associated with her reign. And during the Victorian era, it's a period of colonization for Britain. Britain's really reaching out and spreading its imperial power around the globe. 20% of the Earth's surface and almost 25% of its people were in some way, directly or indirectly, under British rule. And Victorian society, at least back home in Britain, was very much characterized by a focus on proper behavior, morals, and rules of conduct. So it was a very sort of rigid society that really valued religion and morals and good behavior, and in many ways was kind of constricting and suffocating in the fact that it was so rigid. At the same time, though, we're sort of seeing the period being also characterized by medical, technical, and scientific advancement. All these new things happening, and kind of the culture reacted by in some ways becoming more conservative. The Industrial Revolution occurs at this time, which leads to an increasingly urbanized society, but also results in these problems of overcrowding, the easy spread of disease, and poor housing and working conditions. We have higher birth rates during the Victorian period and longer life expectancies, which often led to larger families, which of course were still the main responsibility of women at the time. And the women did not gain suffrage until the modernist era in 1918, a year before the United States. So in the Victorian era, they still would not have had the right to vote, but they did gain that right to vote during Virginia Woolf's time. And again, similarly to the Regency period in Jane Austen, women in the Victorian era were still expected to remain in the private sphere, again, mostly being leaders in the home, and they were supposed to serve as a model of morals and correct behavior for their families. Despite this, though, we are sort of seeing an increasing number of women going to work jobs at this time because of the Industrial Revolution. So women had increasing access to employment, but really only in certain positions, and often for lower wages and for lower level positions than men. And one of the ideas that Virginia Woolf is kind of working against in her writing is this idea of the angel in the house, which becomes a sort of classification for women during the Victorian period. The mid-1800s, Coventry Patmore, a poet, wrote a lengthy narrative poem telling the story of he and his wife Emily's courtship, and this poem was called The Angel in the House. And it really featured an idealized picture of women who were devoted to their husbands and families, brimming with virtues and morals, presented an image of women as meek, submissive, supporting their husbands in everything they did, and that this poem became increasingly popular throughout the 19th century and into the Victorian era as kind of a model of ideal womanhood. And so again, kind of a celebration of what the perfect woman would look like. And of course, these women, the angel in the house, are also very beautiful, they're charming, they're kind of weak and powerless, and they need taking care of by a man. And so in 1931, and 2 years after publishing A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf writes in another piece, killing the angel in the house was part of the occupation of a woman writer. So again, we're already sort of seeing Woolf engaging and taking down and deconstructing some of these ideas of what it meant to be a woman, as she sort of rejects that traditional picture of womanhood and really kind of tries to examine what factors in society have led women to be in the place they currently are in.